Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the panel on K-12 professional development. My name is Michelle Neuman. I'm a lecturer in the International Education Development Program here at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also a senior education specialist at the World Bank, where my work focuses on early childhood development. We have an exciting panel with distinguished panelists, and so I will keep my introductory remarks rather brief. Then I'll introduce the panelists, and hopefully we'll have adequate time for questions and discussion. So as you know from this morning, the Education for All Global Monitoring Report that was released earlier this year focuses on teaching and learning. It calls attention to the 250 million children of primary school age who are not learning the basics in reading and math, and calls it a learning crisis. Of course, there are numerous factors contributing to this learning crisis, but we need to focus on the teachers. That's very, very clear. So we need to focus on the recruitment, training, retention, and ongoing support of teachers and other staff working with children in the school years. We know, for example, that around 5 million teachers are needed to be recruited in order to achieve universal primary education before 2015. We'll need to train them, the new teachers, but also the existing teachers. Because, for example, in a third of the countries, less than 75% of teachers are trained up to national standards. So the questions for this panel today are, what are the roles of MOOCs in supporting teachers and teacher trainers? How can MOOCs expand professional development opportunities in order to improve classroom practices and children's learning outcomes? So I'm delighted to introduce to you our panel. I won't go into much detail because you have their biographical sketches. We'll start the panel with John Macbeth, and he is a professor emeritus from the University of Cambridge, where he has held the chair of educational leadership since 2000. He's also projects director of the Commonwealth Center for Education. He's had a very impressive career working in England and Scotland on school effectiveness and improvement, and he's received numerous honors, including the Order of the British Empire, OBE, in 1997. And he's also been the president of the International Congress on School Effectiveness and Improvement. So welcome. Next we have Gard Titlestad. He is he's the Secretary General of the International Council for Open and Distance Education. He's also been the director of the Nordic Council of Ministers, and he's served in many roles with the European Union and the European Commission, as well as with the Norwegian government. And what I find very interesting is by training, he's a physiochemist. So welcome. And our third panelist is Freda Wolfenden, who's a senior lecturer in education and development at the Open University in the UK. She's worked on teacher education programs in India and sub-Saharan Africa. And she's currently focused on the use of open educational resources to support pedagogical change and issues of gender in developing countries. So each of the panelists will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussions.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here back in the city of brotherly love, or is it brotherly shove? I never remember which. I want to share with you a bit of the work we've been doing in Commonwealth countries, as well as other countries, quite a lot of work in China and Hong Kong, all around this notion of reimagining the profession, thinking differently about the nature of teaching and the nature of learning. We've developed, through the Commonwealth Centre for Education, we've developed a series of 8 courses, and we met in Kuala Lumpur for 4 or 5 days with people from these countries, South Africa, Ghana, Malaysia, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the Maldives. Well, somebody's got to go there, haven't they? And we decided what the topics would be all around the whole area of teaching and learning, what it means to be a teacher, how we understand the process and the challenges of learning in different contexts around the world. So we had a very good kind of contextual representation here of different countries. And the course has now been running, it's now in at least the first 5 courses are now in the second iteration. So we've had about 40,000 students. My role is to work with people in each of these countries so that we do a kind of co-presentation. So unfortunately, it means I've got to travel to these places to work with people, and we do a joint production. One of the places that has been most challenging but also most interesting over the years is work with Dr. George O'Drew in Ghana, and we've been going there now for 4 or 5 years and seen incredible changes in Ghana when you start to address the whole issues of pedagogy and learning in school, learning out of school, which I will talk about a bit more as learning in captivity and learning in the wild. This guy, you may know of him. Big question. I think we addressed this question in the panel yesterday morning, or maybe through the whole, and today. How many lost the impetus to learn because of the way in which learning was experienced by them? So the old adage was Ivan Illich, who said school is a gap in your education. The speakers yesterday were talking about, you remember Stephen, I think it was, that showed that histogram of children very engaged, and that gradually as they went through school there was less and less enjoyment. Now that's not a counsel of despair, it's a challenge to say how do we make the whole experience of learning in and out of school more effective. So on 3 theories. Theory 1, learning is being taught, and I think we've problematized that enough over the last few days to know that there is a very big gap between what teachers teach, unfortunately, and what children learn. And particularly the work in Ghana, where you have classes of maybe, this is a relatively small class actually, taught actually in a room, but you may have classes of up to 150 or more taught under a tree. So in that context, how do you actually move beyond a paradigm of simply delivery of information? Now here's my favorite. This is a classroom, and here's about 30. This is a relatively small classroom, I suppose. And here are the cats. And if you look at the bottom right here, you have the thinking cat. Here he is. Thinking cat here. Not thinking cat. And you have the cat that is asleep over here. He's asleep. That's the cat that's as good as asleep. And this is one of the kind of cartoons that we use with teachers to ask them to think about how do you know? How do you know when young people are actually listening, they're engaged, they're active learners within a classroom? And again, yesterday morning, I think we saw those images of all these schools in different countries and the young people who were engaged or perhaps less engaged. Theory 2, learning is individual sense-making. And that, I suppose, is a kind of a cognitive view that that's how we learn, because individually we have to try and make sense of what we're seeing and what we're hearing. That theory is interestingly tested in this school that I visited in England. We Scots have at times to take the gospel south of the border to the English and elsewhere. But in this school, this was a poster that was up in every classroom. It was in the toilets, it was in the dining room, and the school principal would go around every day, all the time, talking to children and saying, what did you learn in school today? What did you learn in school today? And they might say, well, today in maths we did the mode, the median, and the, what's the other one? The mode, the median, and the mean. Thank you, yes. Thank you. Go to the top of the class. And he would say, no, I didn't ask you what you were taught. I asked you what you learned. And I was leaving the school that day, and he was taking in the car to drive me to the station. And this 11-year-old boy, this was an elementary school, primary school, this 11-year-old boy comes up to him, and he says, excuse me, sir, what did you learn at school today? And I thought that was wonderful about the climate of that school, which was saying it's not just about student learning, it's about what teachers are learning. So The third theory, learning is building knowledge as part of doing things with others. The example here is from a classroom in Shanghai, and they have totally rethought, been challenged about the delivery model and our networking, as again we saw examples of yesterday. One of the people I've worked with over a long period is David Perkins from Harvard, and he has a number of wonderful, simple, economic but very powerful routines for teachers, and we've used these routines in our 8 Commonwealth courses. The one that you can do with 150 children under a tree is think, pair, share. What are you thinking about what I've just talked about? Pair up with somebody else, share your ideas, and then we'll go from there. Or the routine, what do I see? This is quite a deep and challenging routine. What do I see? What do I think about what I see? And what do I wonder about? And then I used to think, now I think. I was doing a course in Hong Kong a number of years ago. It was over a week, and at the end of it I was using these routines, and I said, I used to think, now I think. People would talk about that, and this one guy said, what I used to think and what I think now are exactly the same. So I thought, oh, there's a failure on my part. Well, you know the definition of insanity, going on doing the same thing and expecting different results. So we have to think very out of the box, if you like. So getting there from here, well, if I were you, I wouldn't have started from here. This is the man asking for directions. If I were you, I would not have started from here. And we wouldn't have. We would not have invented the system we have. But we are stuck within that box, if you like, that it's very difficult to think divergently or escape from. You've maybe seen this before. It's in order to be fair, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And this is from Albert Einstein, who you probably heard of, and a fairly smart guy. If you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will spend its entire life believing it's stupid. So to what extent our teaching and our examination systems are falling into that trap, if you like. The OECD, which various different parts of OECD, interestingly doing very different kinds of things, but the radical end of OECD thinking about the future is about how we need to think differently in long-term decision-making, because all of our decision-making is short-term, except in countries like Singapore, for example, where you can think 10, 12 years ahead. But in the UK, of course, we have elections every 4 or 5 years, so decision-making is very short-term. So Coursera, thinking about Coursera as a subversive activity. You may remember Postman Weingarten's book, Teaching as a Subversive Activity. If it's not subversive activity, what is it? It has to disturb the intellectual assumption. It has to challenge the moral base. It has to challenge the political small p, maybe and large p context. So these 3 things, the knowing and the feeling and the doing, are part of that trilogy. Here are some of the things that on our online course that people say. Going on to it, there may be 2,000-3,000 posts from people all over the world. Did that say 15 minutes left?
Exactly.
It said what?
90 seconds.
90 seconds?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. There's a message in there about how time flies when you're talking as opposed to when you're listening. But one of the key messages here, I've learned a lot about my teaching. This is an online course that teachers are actually now talking about. I'm seeing good results because I am making changes in my teaching. So one of the routines, if you like, addressing young people as well as the teachers, does this course, does this class encourage you to ask questions, to make mistakes? That's a wonderful thing, culturally different. If you look at Hofstede stuff about teachers making mistakes, or what countries regard that as the teacher would never make a mistake and how humiliating that is, as opposed to those which are saying mistakes are great, that's how you learn. And Dyson, who we invited into James Dyson, you may not have heard of, he'd invented a cleaner which took the place of the ordinary vacuum cleaner. He came and talked to children in a very deprived school, and they said, how many attempts did you have to make that and get it right? And he said 209. And they said, 209 failures? No, 209 learning opportunities. So on the wall of the classroom, if at first you fail, try again, fail better. So the distinction between learning in captivity and learning in the wild, to what extent can we actually help that extinct unicorn to escape into what David Perkins talks about, learning in the wild. It's not about being taught, it's about how you develop the skills for learning for yourself. I would, if I had time, ask you to have a look at these images. I Googled images on teaching and learning, and I got these images, and if I ask people to have a look at them and say, what do you see here? What does this tell you about the nature of learning and teaching? Some of the things people say, well, it's embedded in relationship, it's always contextualized, it's learner-centered, it's about skills and dispositions, it's enjoyable but always risky, and relaxed but alert. One of the pieces of evaluation, I'm just nearly finished here, promise, where we asked children to draw and paint things about their school, things that they like, things they would like to change, part of a big self-evaluation product which has now been adapted by a long time ago by the government in Scotland. Here's a drawing where we talk about the nature of leadership in the school children. This is a 6-year-old. The head teacher comes to see the children and says, very good. So that's a good piece of data, isn't it, that tells you a lot about the nature of schools. So, in nearly conclusion, what are the things for teachers that we have to say, go on doing those things? There are lots of things you've got to stop doing, and what are the things you may start doing? So it's not a question of suddenly starting to do something different, but how you actually go on doing what's successful, and how do you manage the tension between that globalized external policy world, which is very impatient, very short-term, very reactionary in many ways, and the internal world of the classroom. Finally, what is within my own control? What can I do as a teacher? And what lies within the horizon of possibilities? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for those challenging questions about how we understand teaching and learning and how we can follow through with those ideas in different contexts. So dark. So next we have Gard. Let's talk about quality online education.
Thank you Dan, thank you Pan for inviting me. ICD is a membership organization and it's an NGO, and the core of its membership is institutional members, but it is also associations and individuals that are members in all regions of the world, and what is binding them together is the commitment to quality, open, distance, online, e-learning, partly or focused or only as blended. ICD has been around for about 75 years, and we also, in addition to have a headquarter in Oslo, which makes it the only global NGO that has a headquarter in Norway, it also has a scientific journal that the editor is located in Spain at UNED. Open Practice, that is now 1 year as a scientific journal and is still improving very much. Since the 60s, we have been in partnership with UNESCO, and we have had and has many ongoing issues that we share values and achievements with UNESCO. This is the executive committee that is elected by the members every second year, and as you can see, it's well distributed around the world. And it's Tian Belavati, Universitas Tarbuka, that is the president now, but also a colleague on my co-panelist is at the executive committee for ICDE. Just a small talk related to the theme, that is, for example, Tian Belavati. She runs a university that has about 400,000 students, and 80% of them are teachers. So that gives you an idea of what some of the members in ICDE do. And another here, Mandla Makenya, the principal and vice chancellor of University of South Africa, UNISA. As I've learned, UNISA has about 400,000 students. They educate half of the teachers in Africa. But of course, it's not the same for all. We also have membership with 4 employees. So it is quite different. I show this picture of the next World Conference for ICDE in October 2015 will be in Africa, hosted by UNISA, and I think that would be a wonderful opportunity for following up many of those issues that have been discussed at this conference, at the soil of Africa, and for sure the teacher issue will be followed up at that conference. Just to give you a few introductory remarks on the big picture when it comes to open and distance education, and that is independent of MOOCs. And all over the world, in all regions, it has been a steadily growing open distance education in the last 10 years. And of course, in most parts of the world, the share of that is online education increasing. So that is the big picture. The big picture, as you already has heard from others, illustrated here with these graphics that shows tertiary enrollment by region back to 1970 up to 2007, shows the enormous growth and from elite universities to a diverse massification of higher education. But we have only seen the start, the beginning. For what is to come, the next 15 years is this, where we've, according to numbers calculated by OECD and the EU, would expect about 410 million students, which is an enormous increase from what we have today. So that is in higher education. So why I'm talking about that when we should talk about teachers? Well, basically teachers are educated by higher education institutions. So if that challenge is not addressed to them, that already has this enormous growth, we will not be capable of handling what is happening. So we need to address this as a major issue for the higher education institutions, and they have to be crucial in solving that problem. And then again, it is about the teacher's trainer. This is the indication what is needed by 2015. And as you know, it is in particular in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where the need for teachers are biggest. And it doesn't stop here, because if you look for the next 15 years, the need for new teachers will even grow faster than up to now. What I, of course, have a little, question mark for, that is when, public governments write publication, they tend to write new teachers needed in the classroom. Right? In the classroom. Should they be in the classroom? Well, I don't think we will be capable of solving the issue about teachers if it is teachers in the classroom. So, knowing that needs and knowing the opportunities from open distance, online, MOOCs, whatever it takes, the idea to have a project that could establish an open educational resource that could be taught and could be shared and could be learned online was conceptualized. And the project today has the name Bringing Educational Resources to Africa for Teachers in Africa, BETA. The idea, which was expressed like this, to develop a high-quality open educational resource as an open online courseware for training teachers, faculty in open distance and online learning. The target group, teacher trainers. The first regional area of priority should be Africa, and a regional focus on Asia will be considered when the project has delivered. And brackets has shown to be good. After an open call for interest, the Open University of Catalonia and South African Institute for Distance Education created a consortium to do that. I should say this is a very modest project. It's more like a symbol, and these two institutions do it for almost no money. So it's not because of the money or the funding. It's because they think it is important. And the objectives, very briefly, is to then collate a set of OER and that are relevant to teachers' education, and that this will be put together in a courseware. There will be a possibility to use already developed educational methodologies in an European project to explore the new pedagogical opportunities and to ensure that this is anchored in Africa. Those stakeholders that are in Africa, those stakeholders, like for example Tesla, that already are in the field, will be consulted, will be in some way connected to the project. I should say one underlying aim from ICDE's side with this project is to make it visible, the need visible, and so that all those that already work on these issues can have, an opportunity for more coordinating themselves and to share knowledge, how to make open educational resources available online, as a MOOC, for example, or something else, to meet the needs for quality teaching in Africa. And here is the list of the stakeholders that these days are invited to a collaborative knowledge network. Most of these stakeholders has already been consulted and indicated their interest and gave input to the project description. So it's quite many. And this is, of course, because one of the purposes, again, is awareness about the issue. And most of these has a huge experience to tap into. The timeline for the project, this looks big, but the timeline is very short. It will deliver to summer, this summer. But as you can see, there are strands of cooperation, awareness, anchoring, improvement, fundraising, because if it delivers something that is really usable, funds are needed. So then we have to work on fundraising. So if it is really usable, then it can be improved, it can be distributed, it can be discussed at the President Summits, which ICD organized this autumn, at the Global Conference next year, at African Virtual Universities next conference next year, etc. And of course, what we are after here is, in the end of the day, the effect. As an appendix, just a few reflection related to MOOC or MOOC, which is a discussion that we cannot avoid. A survey of those major initiatives in MOOCs available shows that it's only one at the moment that is based on open education resources. The rest are not. They are open, but not in the meaning open education resources. And that is open up ed. We hope this will change, at least that the MOOCs initiatives that are ongoing will declare what is the situation regarding the content, because that is of huge interest for the user. We had a think tank in Beijing on MOOCs last year, and What we came up with there as a summary, I have made an excerpt here, and in particular what have been repeated again and again, and also on this conference, it need to be a contextualized strategies when implementing MOOCs, and we will put that at heart when it comes to teachers' education. And I will end this presentation by supporting what was expressed by Dr. Kim Tam at the last General Conference of UNESCO, that we have to reconfirm the fundamental principles of education, that education is a fundamental human right, it is a public good, it is a basis for man's attainment of peace, sustainable development, gender equality, and responsible global citizenship. And it is a key factor in reducing inequality and poverty. You can read the rest, and I should say, and end this presentation, this is why we're doing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing the results of the initial activities. And perhaps joining you in 2015 at the conference. Okay. And our third speaker, Freda. Will talk to us about improving classroom practice. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. I'm just going to share a few thoughts from some of the teacher education programs that we've been involved in the Open University over the last 15 to 20 years. I started off, like many speakers here, by just drawing together a few thoughts from the recent GMR report. I won't repeat those because we've already shared many of those at this conference. But I just wanted to draw your attention to two particular points that are made in the report, or one point in the report and maybe another point that kind of underpins the report that perhaps haven't had quite so much space at this conference. One is that the report does talk very clearly about the need for education for teacher educators. As we know, many people who are involved in teacher education across the world don't have very much experience of the classrooms for which they're preparing teachers. Not only is there a history of people who did well in university education, then going on to become teacher educators without actually doing any time in the classroom themselves, but there's also the fact that those classrooms have changed very rapidly over the last 10 to 15 years with the advent of EFA, as we have seen many millions more children go into school, which is fantastic. Teachers in those schools are now dealing with much less homogeneous groups of children, many more multilingual classrooms, children with disabilities, and so on. And many of the teacher educators have very little idea of those conditions and very few strategies that they can use with the teachers that they're training. So there is a need for education of teacher educators. I'm going to come back to that in my last slide. Also, I just want to say that much of this work is framed by the global policy focus on learner-centered education at school level. If you look at policy documentation from a large number of countries across the world, there's a huge amount of rhetoric about wanting to see learner-centered education in their classrooms. I would suggest that's a fairly contested term, and we've probably all got very different interpretations of it, but I just want to say that's something that is out there framing this work on teacher education. So the Open University, just in case you don't know, is a very large distance education university in the UK, which has been involved with educating teachers since it was set up 45 years ago. Initially teachers in the UK, but increasingly teachers across the globe. And we have run a large number of teacher education programs, all of which are at scale. That's how we work. So here I've just put a few of the ones that we've been involved in recently. teachandlearn.net was a CPD program for British teachers. TESA, which I've worked on since it started in 2005, is a program for teachers in sub-Saharan Africa, which has developed a large bank of open educational resources that are available in several different languages, many different versions, and are now in use across 12 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Just jumping a bit, English in Action is a project that's been going for 5 years, working with a large number of schools in Bangladesh to improve their teaching of English in primary and secondary schools. And TESS India is a kind of latest addition to our portfolio of projects. We're funded by DFID, UK Aid, to work with the Indian government to reach a very large number of teachers in 7 states in India to improve their classroom practices through the development of open educational resources. I'm not going to spend much time on this. Actually, I think John has covered many of these points. I just want to say that all our programs are really underpinned by a model of teacher development, a model in which we see teachers practice emerging from their understandings of knowledge, their epistemological viewpoint. Do they see knowledge as being something that's fixed and out there and pure, or is it something that's constructed and developed with their learners? What theories of learning do they hold? What views of their learners and what they bring to the classroom? And what kinds of pedagogy do they think are appropriate? And all of those influence the kinds of practices that teachers engage in their classrooms. And so changing practice to try and make it more effective, so that the 250 million learners we heard about have a more productive classroom experience, involves disruptions to some of those theories so that we can get shifts in practice. We are hoping to develop teachers who have these kinds of characteristics, have repertoires, routines. Actually, I was very struck by using the word routine. That's a word we use quite a lot. Routines are within the classroom to meet the needs of diverse learning situations, co-construct knowledge with their learners, recognise that their learners bring with them multiple experiences, skills, languages and so on into the classroom. Those are a resource, and view learners as problem solvers who will be intrinsically motivated if the problems they're given are meaningful to them, they're authentic to those learners. So, our teacher education programmes, they're working in very different contexts. We're working with a very large range of partners, sometimes other universities, some NGOs, government ministries, and so on. But they do have lots of common features. And I've just pulled out here some of the common features, which I think are really critical when we're thinking about building MOOCs for teachers and teacher educators. So for a long time, we have been designing our courses with very small chunks of learning that are collaboratively developed. We always work with local partners to support them developing the materials through series of workshops and critical readers and so on. I really don't want to give the impression that these programs are UK content that is exported. It is very much us facilitating and collaborating with our colleagues in these different countries. And at the centre of all these materials are classroom activities that teachers undergo with their learners. So just as we feel it's important that learners have authentic activities, so teachers need to have authentic activities in order to learn. They need to have suggestions for them to try out within their own classroom. We use a lot of case studies to show how teachers facing similar challenges, similar opportunities, have been able to experiment the kinds of problems they've encountered and how they've gone back. I think one of my previous colleagues has talked about that again, about how when things haven't gone right, they've gone back and they've tried again. We use multimedia resources. We try and have collaborative spaces but most of the time those are not online collaborative spaces. Those are maybe face-to-face spaces at local tutorial centres, study centres, district offices, maybe in the school. We create the materials in the local language. So the project in India that I'm now leading, we're working in 7 states. All the materials will be localised for each of those states and available in the language of instruction of that state. And we feel that materials have to be available in very flexible formats. In Testa, most of the teachers access the materials, even now, in print copy. They have them given to them by maybe the college they're working with, district officials and so on. And they're all open materials under Creative Commons license. So what have we learned from all these projects? We hope we're on an iterative cycle of development with the projects, and we're always feeding back our learning into them. One thing we have learned is the importance of a broker, somebody to support the teacher in taking those materials and enacting out the activities in their classroom. So that broker can take many forms. It could be a university lecturer for a teacher who's on a formal BEd or diploma course. It could be a visiting tutor, district tutor or district official who goes around to the school. It could be the head teacher. It could be a peer teacher. But most of the time there is somebody who is helping that teacher, supporting them in their engagement with the materials. It's been tricky sometimes to find a balance between the local and the global when developing the materials and localising them. Teachers do want to have examples of other teachers in different countries undertaking similar kinds of classroom activities, but they also need to recognise their own context when they read about activities and case studies. So getting that balance is sometimes quite tricky. We've already referred to the need for offline formats, including print, and something that we found extremely challenging is encouraging people to post back up, to share back up their own amended versions of the open resources. We go around classrooms and colleges and we see lots of fantastic innovation with them, but so far we've found it really difficult to encourage people to share that back up for a wider community. So, just to conclude, we are, one of the exciting things that we're doing as part of the India project is we're going to be developing a MOOC for teacher educators. This is really to support capacity building for teacher educators around pedagogic approaches and the use of OER within their own courses. We're very fortunate in that there's going to be funding for a core group of Indian teacher educators to come and spend some time with us in the UK at the OU while we're developing the MOOC. So we hope that it will be a really collaborative development. Again, it won't be something which we have put together here and then taken out to India. But I'm going to suggest that despite all the things I've heard in the last few days, there are still a number of quite big challenges that we have in developing that. Accessibility being something we've heard a lot about. Accreditation. People are very keen that there is some form of accreditation on this MOOC. Certification. We haven't yet got any ideas about how we will work that. Do we need to put in some kind of face-to-face support? Experience tells us that we probably do in order to retain people through the course. Who might be an appropriate partner to do that? How do we find out a little bit about the participants' background and prior experience when we've got hundreds or thousands of people on a course? As teacher educators, one of the things that we do a lot of work with our teachers is know your learners. How can you know your learners when there are so many there? Do you just aim for the kind of middle? Do you take a guess? How do you cope with diversity and then accessibility for all the learners? And how do we make something that's sustainable and that can be taken by local institutions, translated and used by them after our own project funding has finished? Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing the perspectives and your lessons learned from the teacher-trainer efforts. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions for any of our panelists. Well, while you're thinking of a question, I have a few, so I will start with one. One of the things that keeps coming up is the importance of making sure that we're reaching those who could benefit most from these types of opportunities. So how do we ensure that those teachers and teacher trainers who have the least access to opportunities for ongoing professional development or even initial training have the opportunities to get involved in these types of initiatives? And I was interested in your thoughts on how we might do that in order to really make sure that we're strengthening equity and perhaps not working at counter purposes.
Nobody want to answer your question, right? It's probably too difficult to answer with a practical solution, but when you talk about those that really have the worst access to technology, to resources, and that you want to have them into an education situation, I think, from my point of view, the key answer is that the educational institutions in that area have to have a strategy for that. And that has to probably be taken several measures. So it is not one simple answer as I can see. And in the end of the day, it's people that is most important. Whatever technology that exists, technology only is a way of doing things better to a lower price, to reach out to more, when it helps. So if it is on paper or it is on radio, etc., I think the history and distance education have given that answer. You can't provide a MOOC where nobody to have access to it. It doesn't give any sense, right? So then you have to use those means that are the best in that area. And normally that is best known by those that are educators responsible for that area. So thank you.
I want to kind of agree but slightly disagree, because I just think there's also a need to disrupt some of the thinking of some of the educators in some of those institutions, because we do see in some countries a kind of set of policies and practices which say require teachers to leave rural schools and go to colleges for upgrading programs, and so actually that makes the situation worse for the children who are left in that school. And actually I think sometimes people become so kind of immersed in the situation they're in, which is quite challenging, that it's difficult for them to think about new ways of doing things. And so actually I would suggest that allowing educators in those situations opportunities to share thoughts collectively across regions and areas about how they resolve those issues is critical, and also about how we reach those teachers without removing them from their communities, which can be done, as you said, with paper copies, with some kind of face-to-face perhaps, or tuition, or with SMS. Several people, I think, UNICEF and other colleges and universities in South Africa, for example, have been using SMS quite successfully as other institutions in order to contact learners in very remote areas.
I'm going to make a confession. I was doing one of my own cats there, because while you were talking and asking the question, I was kind of distracted and I wasn't listening, so I didn't hear the question. It's just an exemplification of even Cambridge professors are equally cat-like at times.
Would you like me to repeat it?
Yes, please.
Yes, basically what I'm trying to understand is I think that you're describing different ways through different uses of technology to improve the quality of the teaching the teachers and their practices in the classroom. And I guess my question again is we're moving beyond this notion that anyone can participate. We're narrowing it in onto either the teacher trainers or the teachers themselves. And how do we make sure that through those efforts we're really reaching those who need that support the most? And I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts or lessons from your experiences so far.
I suppose I would have to sort of problematize the notion of technology here, because technology encompasses a range from a pencil or a pen to very sophisticated technology, and because of most of the work that, probably most of the work I've been doing has been in Ghana, where you sometimes don't even have a pencil, or you share a pencil. So the technology of how do you maximize the resources that you've actually got, and how do you, well, when I say pencils, although they're maybe not pencils, often there are actually mobile phones. So how do you really intelligently harness that kind of technology? And at the opposite end of the extreme, countries like Hong Kong, where I'm also working in on a continuous basis, which are actually very resource-rich at times, you get a whole different kind of orientation to technology. And interestingly, many schools will say, leave your mobile phones at the door. And I'm interested in any comments about schools that you work in which saying, bring your mobile phones into the classroom, because we're going to harness that technology. And there are some places, there's a wide spectrum in Hong Kong from those who say leave them at the door to those bring your mobile phones in, because we can then use that technology in a very powerful kind of way.
Questions? Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Hello. Oh, yeah. My name is Ruchira Goswami. I'm from University of Pennsylvania. And my question is, when you're considering a platform such as MOOC for teacher educators, how do you determine the effectiveness of it? Are you measuring effectiveness of MOOCs for teacher educators in terms of enrollment, attrition rate? I mean, how do you know whether that initiative has been effective or successful, so to speak? And my second question is that in developing countries, there are already platforms such as in-service teacher trainings there in place. So having MOOCs as a medium to reach out to teacher educators, how does MOOCs have leverage over normal in-service teacher trainings that are already in place in developing countries? So, yeah.
Even I haven't done anything of what you asked of, I can still try to respond on the thoughts about it, right? Because if that project, that data is deliver a good courseware that can be used in a MOOC, I think it is crucial that that university or that institution that will take up that MOOC have a strategy for doing that. All steps of the strategy, what to achieve, what target groups, what are the learning objectives, and follow up on that. In addition to that, if it is possible to have fundraising for follow research, as we say, that are initiated in the start of the project and follow the project and deliver knowledge at the end of the project, I think that is the best way of measuring whether you achieve what you targeted through your strategy. So that is, to put it blunt and simple. The second issue on, to find ways in areas with very poor technological infrastructure, it is said for many that the most promising technology at the moment is, when it comes to high capacity, is mobile broadband. And that is also that technology in the world that is increasing most rapidly. we have never seen any technology in the world that has increased that rapidly, that mobile broadband. So, for example, I participated in a workshop to look at how can we rebuild higher education in Libya, and they have a really poor infrastructure. It's really bad, but they have 13.6 penetration in mobile broadband. So if you want to target teachers, that is possible to use. So that is an asset that you can use and target the strategy through that infrastructure. So that is an example. You have to be very specific for each area because it is nothing that is the same. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to respond?
Maybe I'll just add a few points to that. I think one of the reasons that we're planning to do this MOOC for teacher educators is that there actually is very little out there at the moment for teacher educators as opposed to teachers themselves. And so what we're hoping by this is to firstly work at scale, but I think more importantly, as far as the teacher educators are concerned, is to develop some sense of community, of sharing across institutions, maybe because this will work across quite a large area in India, across even perhaps states, different forms of teacher education. So those are the kinds of things that we're hoping to achieve. How we know it's been successful? I guess I'm going to echo what Russell said this morning about FutureLearn. I don't think people reaching the end of the MOOC is necessarily a good indicator of whether the MOOC has been successful or not. People can sit in a classroom all year and not necessarily learn very much, so they can be part of that MOOC for the whole of its entirety and not move forward. So we will be looking much more about what are the changes perhaps in the programs that those teacher educators have some responsibility for. Have they reshaped the practices that are in there, the kinds of relationships that they have with the trainee teachers, the expectations that they have of them? Have they developed their own OER? What do those look like? So I think that we're looking for multiple outcomes from the MOOC. But I would also say that change is very slow. From my own experience, one of the things that one's continually talking to funders about is that you can't expect change to happen just like that. Teacher change is something that really evolves over quite a long period of time.
I was listening this time, yes. Never disagree with you, no. No, I was, in terms of the evaluation question, I mean, how do you know each of the baseline is how many stay with it? And we know that, 8 to 10%, something like that, is the retention rate. But if you go a bit further into a more qualitative kind of evaluation, what we've tried to do from the very outset of our courses is build a self-evaluation routines and thinking into it. So those questions that I used to think, now I think, constantly bringing people back to evaluate their own learning, think about your learning, think and share. And when you go onto the forums, there is a huge amount of evidence of people rethinking their practice and sharing that. And it's an incredibly wonderful resource to look how people are actually learning. It's a peer learning, it's a collaborative learning that you get. So a lot of the themes of the last 2 days really resonate about a different kind of pedagogy. It's a different language. It's not the language of delivery, which I take issue with politicians all the time. I was on Tony Blair's task force for 4 years, and they kept talking about delivering the curriculum. I said, please do not use that word. We do not deliver. People create their own knowledge. We don't pass knowledge on to people. And it's been one of the themes of the forums. One of the things, in answer to the second question about where we look for support and understanding, one of the things we've tried to do, and I know it's challenging in some contexts, is to get children to be the evaluators. I mean, we've worked for about 20, 30 years on children evaluating the quality of learning and teaching in their classrooms and in their schools. And in some places that is still hugely challenging. But again, going back to Hong Kong, there are some incredible, wonderful examples of children who are routinely setting aside time during the week to have discussions with their teachers about how they are evaluating the quality of teaching and the quality of learning. And those schools really kind of moved ahead terrifically because they have been open teachers have become open to being challenged and to rethink and say, I sat in a classroom there once for 50 minutes and the teacher said, I'm just going to ask you about what helps you in your learning and what hinders. And this little girl said, you know, really what hinders my learning is when we're working together in pairs and we're buzzing away and we're learning, and then you say, stop, put down your pencils and listen to me. You stop our learning. And I watched how she was going to respond to that challenge. And she was wonderful. She said, now that's interesting, isn't it? Not what am I going to do, how are we going to address that issue in our classroom? And I thought that was a wonderful way of saying, I'm not the problem solver in this classroom, we're in this together, we do this together. But that changing that culture doesn't just happen overnight, it takes a while.
Yes, go ahead.
You know, I have one comment now. I'm going home after this panel, right? Not because
Is it that bad?
not because it's that bad, because I have to, right? It's, you know, it's about playing timing in that. But anyway, you know, sometimes the discussion about MOOCs, it's too simple, right? Because, you know, MOOCs, in the way they occurred in the US a few years ago, is because it is a high infrastructure, you have a population that are mature regarding online. It is because you have one market, one language, right? So when that, you know, great innovation would penetrate into the world, it would change all the time. So you can't, you know, take that model and discuss how will that work in South Africa or in Indonesia. It's not possible. You have to think different. So talking about disruption, I think that you should disrupt your thinking, right? Because you have to think totally different, not US-like MOOCs for development. I don't think that would work. You have to think, how are the situations in those countries? What are their conditions? What are their comparative benefits, so to speak? What can you build on? Because you cannot build on the weaknesses, right? So if you start to come with something that is developed in the US and try to, you know, implement that, you sometimes try to build on weaknesses, and that would not be sustainable, right? It won't work. So you have to find out what are the strengths and what can you build on, and go from there. And probably you find a lot of strengths, but then you have to look at it. And you know, when MOOCs came to Norway, which is also a developed country, at least to some extent, they talk, not English, but Norwegian. It's a very small language. And, you know, the government found out they want to appoint the MOOC commission. They have. And they did, you know, they've done a green paper almost. And the first thing they did was to change the definition of MOOC. Why? Because it's only 5 million in Asia, right? So you can't have real MOOC there. So you need to, so what do you do if you want to do a MOOC? You change the definition, right? So it is not massive. It don't have to be massive anymore. It only have to be possible massive, right? That is the new definition. Because that will work in Norway. And it changed a lot. And I think this will go on. One will use this innovation, and it will, you know, be for a lot of inspiration. Many will benefit from it, but it will take totally different formats from what it took in the US.
So it becomes the POOC.
No, sorry, this was, I won't open my mouth anymore. At least at this time.
Yes, please.
My name is Masinya Dikuta from Molteno Institute in South Africa. I just wanted to ask, I would like a comment from the panelists, particularly on the issue of sustainability of MOOCs. If, for instance, it's depending on the you know, the smartphones or whatever kind of gadgets of the teachers, because there are costs related to bandwidth. And our own anecdotal experience is that some teachers feel that state is responsible for providing them access to bandwidth, and if they don't, then they feel like it's an encroachment on their private space, onto their own personal resources. Some of them are just not willing to use it for professional development. They would rather use that for their own personal development. I wonder if it's something that you have experienced in your work.
I'd like to answer that question about sustainability and the cost burden.
Okay, sustainability and cost, right? Over to you.
Start. Very good question. I think, well, the approach that we've taken in all our projects, where we've done very little engagement with hardware, so we have done what I think lots of people have talked about here, which is to interrogate what's out there, what people have access to, and harness that, so provide them the OER in the format that people can access. So a lot of the time that has been paper format, or it's been kind of accessed through an intranet or CDs and so on. I mean, I think for me, there's a kind of under discussion about offline use, and so many teachers that I see sometimes do have access to perhaps some old PC into which they can load a CD, or we're seeing people with access to very low-cost tablets, but they don't have the means to get those on to access the internet, but they can still have a lot of resources stored on that, and they can still engage in learning through those low-cost tablets. So I think it's back to what we've been saying all along. It's about the learning. It's about thinking about what it is that you want, what kind of learning experience you want to develop with people, where they want to move, how they want to deepen their practice, and then you find the technologies that will support that. I know that's an issue, but perhaps sometimes also I think if governments were prepared to think a little bit more imaginatively about uses of technology, and for me actually, rather than be focusing on pupils and technology, a better place to look would be for teachers first of all to become comfortable with technology, give teachers small laptops or tablets. Teachers, yeah. So.
One of the things right from the beginning in Ghana, we didn't want to go and say, our course is called Leadership for Learning, and we had built a whole set of principles working with different countries around the world, but when we were invited to Ghana, we said we're not going in here with what works in Seattle and what works elsewhere in the world, but we'd like to test out and learn from you and get a whole range of different ideas. And the challenge was that when we started to talk, people would come into it and they'd start writing down and they'd start taking down everything we said. We said, no, we're not going to do no note-taking, no. We want in the first instance to kind of learn from you and begin to share and then begin to build something here which is relevant and related to the Ghana culture. Luckily we had George Odru and a number of really outstanding people right from the beginning. And what they did was they created a cadre of 15 people who were to be the critical friends. These are your mentors, these are your intermediary people, 15 critical friends. And because of the quality of those people, we were able to go from there to 150 schools, and from the 150 to 300. And it built from the ground up from a very small group of people, very biblical notion, the disciples, who went out and they began to change the country. But from that small, and eventually it was the circuit supervisors, and then eventually it was the district officers, and eventually we were working with the regional officers, and eventually the Minister of Education. And we didn't start with the ministry, but then at the end of 3-4 years of this, there was enough persuasive evidence that the ministry redid their policies on learning and teaching and on leadership, and that's now embedded. But it wasn't us that did it. It was a growth right from a small 15 people, like the 12 disciples going out and beginning to change over a period of time. Most intervention programs in Africa have a 2-3 year lifespan, and people come in and they do wonderful things and then they go away again. And when we first went there, they were very suspicious. Oh, here we go, University of Cambridge, yet another one, and 3 years from now you'll be gone and we'll be left on our own and nothing will happen. And we said, this is a long-term commitment and it's going to be you. It's not going to be us who make the change.
Thank you. You can take one last question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to underscore what John just said, also based on our own experience with the change. Yes, you go in and you try to empower people, but they themselves, they may feel empowered, but there are still, real hierarchies that they cannot jump over. And I think engaging the higher levels in whatever way one can is really the key to success as well. Yes, you want to give them the skills to challenge, but they themselves and on their own are not going to be able to challenge all the time. We've also begun to include the users in our training programs, and it is really that kind of formula that ultimately then allows you to build up faster and include more people. I have a question though, and a lot was said over the last couple of days also about peer assessment, etc. But very little has been said about peer tutoring. And I was just wondering, especially in relation to what Freda was mentioning, the MOOC that you were trying to develop, which is a train the trainers kind of course. To what extent is that going to be built in as, the medium is the message, trying to test people? I was just curious.
It absolutely, it's built in at the moment when it actually happens. So the aim is that we have a group of people that we work very closely with in kind of designing it, and so those become the kind of peer mentors, teachers within the first iteration, which will be a pilot iteration, because I think there are a lot of issues that we won't be able to attempt to look at until we actually have some people undertaking it on the ground in India. And then we're hoping that some of that first cohort will then go on to become the peer coaches and so on in the next cohort. So that we have it sort of theoretically conceptualized, whether that actually works or not. So I'd be very interested in any other people's experience of doing that. I think some of the challenges are going to be how we recognise the skills that those people will develop as they take on that role, because it will be very much a learning experience for them as well, I'm sure. So we'll have to think about how we value that, and we don't just kind of leave them there at the end of it, and how we can take them further forward as well. So, just thinking, yeah, sorry.
Maybe you should give one last comment.
Okay, question. Who do children learn most from? Who do teachers learn most from? Do children learn most from parents, teachers, Ministry of Education? Who is it? Well, we know it's the peer effect, but the peer effect is the strongest influence on children's learning. Who do teachers learn from? University professors from Cambridge, Open University, Oslo, ICD. Teachers learn from teachers. So the whole peer effect, how do you build in that, which is absolutely relevant to the question that you're asking, Barbara, because if you build in peer learning, that's the most powerful of all. And one of the things I wanted to say, and I didn't, was talking about your concept of the geography of thought, because it's such a powerful idea, actually. We begin across these geographical spaces, and people talk about ideas traveling and disseminating ideas, but when we understand the geography of thought, we understand how much it's embedded within different cultures. Seek first to understand before seeking to be understood.
Okay, well then I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the panelists for challenging us and for raising many questions for us to continue to think about in the days and years to come.